Hello, this is a presentation given after the Chudleigh Wild AGM in January 2021. It's a review of some of the wildlife highlights and indeed the Chudleigh Wild highlights of 2020 up to the time of the AGM, and to some extent it's a rather personal view. Now, one of the special wildlife features of Chudleigh are our bat populations, and in particular Greater Horseshoe Bats. And Chudleigh Rocks here is the location for several caves where the bats both breed and overwinter. The cave entrances have grills to prevent illegal entry. There are ways in, and licensed bat workers go in on a regular basis to monitor both the breeding and the wintering population of greater horseshoes and other bats. So thanks to the efforts of David and Colin Wills, we have data for the last 20 or so years, and rather encouragingly, if anything, these are showing evidence of small increases in both the breeding population and the wintering numbers. So in the case of the wintering numbers, possibly as much as doubling over the last 20 years. And that's really very encouraging, particularly in view of the development around the periphery of Chudleigh that has inevitably resulted in the loss of feeding areas and possibly some commuting routes. And this has been happening now, of course, for several decades, and it will continue into the future, I'm sure. But we're particularly keen to keep an eye on the greater horseshoes, not just at this focal point of their existence in Chudleigh, but also to look at how they're using the surrounding countryside, and in particular skirting around Chudleigh. Chudleigh Rocks lies so close to the town that it's vital that we make sure they have routes to and from, dark routes to and from the caves out to their foraging areas. So there's a greater horseshoe bat hanging up, and a map based on the results of a radio tracking study carried out in 2002. So a little bit old hat perhaps. The blue circle, red ringed, shows the location of Chudleigh Rocks, and the yellow, the routes that bats took and the areas that they were seen to be foraging, or sorry, not seen, but located as foraging. The arrows mark routes across roads, or in the case of the A38, underneath the A38. And we're very keen to make sure that those crossing points are maintained. That blue circle there in particular is an area of interest. It's at the top of Station Hill, where the bats certainly 20 years ago were regularly crossing the road, but now we have unfortunately a bright light that seems to have prevented them going across there. So during the spring and summer, in a very socially distanced way, certain members of the committee and others went out with bat detectors on fine evenings at specific locations, and we recorded the numbers as soon as it went dark, and probably for about an hour after that, to see how they were moving out of the breeding area into the surrounding countryside. So early on we discovered that they were using the old railway bridge, of course now no longer a railway, at the bottom of Station Hill between the A38 and the River Teign. So small numbers were coming under here. They were also going down Cape Brook. We knew that they were using that and actually going under the A38 through a culvert and out towards the River Teign as well. From there they get access either to go upstream or downstream along the river corridor, or to cross the road and go into Finn Lake. But quite a potentially important area for the bats to gain access to the River Teign Valley. So this is the top of Station Hill, and that yellow oval there is an offending light. That previously was a major crossing point. You can see on the left the new development at the Oaks, and a hedgerow has been put in to reinforce what was an important corridor for the bats going out from Chudleigh Rocks to the right down to the A38 and the Teign Valley to the left. Looking down the hill here, we discovered that the bats are now using the overhanging trees as a nice dark route across the road, to some extent going around the Rocklands development, which you can just see through the trees. And we also discovered that below Rocklands, a number of them, maybe just into double figures, were crossing and going over this gate and through the woodland, and thence across the bottom of Oldway and alongside the A38. And from there they come out at the tunnel, the underpass under the A38, and they come in from the left here and go under the tunnel. And also some use the Oldway Batfields Reserve bat run, as we call it, across the top of Oldway and down the lane past the sewage works and into the tunnel here. So it was good to know that a number of them were still using these routes. You can see there on the left Sue and Vicky getting ready on a lovely evening, going to walk off into the sunset down towards the underpass to monitor the bats going through. So with the information that we gathered during the spring and summer, and also to some extent the previous year, we were able to produce this map, the blue arrows showing the routes the bats were taking, and the purple writing there highlighting to the developers and to Teignbridge Council and the Highways Department that we had an issue with the street light. We were also keen to find out where most of the bats out of the rocks, out of the caves, are actually going. We could account for maybe 20 of them heading westwards down Kate Brook or across to the area I've just been talking about. And we know some also go up Kate Brook, possibly up towards Harkham. But the previous study, the radio tracking study, showed some crossing points into Ugbrook Park and then through the park to the A380 and to some extent beyond that. And what we did by stationing ourselves at various points in riding parks and along the lane along the top of Ugbrook Ridge is we determined that most of them seem to be heading out this way, straight southwards almost, to cross into the park from here. We'll be doing some more work on the bats this coming year, in particular looking further up Kate Brook where there are developments in the plan, and to see how they're using the land and what corridors are important to them there. So this is the Harkham Split road junction with the A38. This is what's known as a Devon County Council special verge. There's the sign on the fence that indicates the months. That's March to August, when there should be no cutting along the verges here. And this is particularly in view of the orchid population here. So this is a poster that we put together for the caravan park at Holman's Wood. Sadly, because of COVID-19, probably not many people got to see it, given the reduced numbers of visitors there. But I'd like to just highlight that sentence there, which stresses that this is one of the most important sites in Devon for wild orchids. We've recorded, I think, 9 species of orchids here over the years. They've been monitored now for several decades by Michelle Hughes, and Chudleigh Wild has latterly taken over the job of counting the orchids as best we can. In 2020 that was a fairly well spaced affair, of course, as we were socially distanced, but we did come up with these totals. I think the outstanding species and total, of course, there is 532 greater butterfly orchids. The bee orchids didn't appear in such numbers as the previous year, but they are very variable anyway from year to year. Greater butterfly is certainly the one for which the site is best known. But we also had a few pyramidal orchids which don't appear every year, and indeed also some tway blades. Let's move to the River Teign. We have some nice waterways, particularly fringing the west side of the parish, the River Teign and then Bramble Brook, which heads up towards Haldon. And of course I've already mentioned Kite Brook. And down on the River Teign this year we found evidence that mandarin ducks were breeding. This is not a native species in Britain, but one which is expanding its population, and it's thought we may now have more mandarin ducks than in their far eastern native habitats. We also have, rather more characteristically perhaps, of our rivers, dippers, and several pairs present. And ditto grey wagtails, a rather badly named bird given the amount of wonderful bright lemon yellow on the underparts, but grey wagtail, a resident bird with us on the watercourses and sometimes in winter around the buildings. We've also got a small breeding population in Devon of goosanders. This is one of the sawbill ducks. You can possibly just about see the serrations on the bill that tell you this is a fish-eating duck, and rivers are their main summer and to some extent winter habitat. They will move on to lakes and reservoirs during the winter months, but here on the Teign we have probably only a pair or two somewhere along the valley. We certainly saw a pair regularly this spring, and within our parish we've had a brood of goosanders in recent years. So quite possibly breeding, and there are going to be hopefully some large nesting boxes put up on waterside trees that goosanders will hopefully use. They're a tree nesting duck, as indeed are the mandarin ducks. So they like big holes in dead trees or dying trees, or nest boxes. Moving up on to Holden Hills, which of course are largely clothed in these rather monotonous plantations of conifers. It was a great surprise during my spring lockdown walks to find quite reasonable numbers of this gem of a bird, the firecrest. It came as a big surprise. We knew that they were expanding their range in southern England. It's a rare bird nationally with special protection, and we had seen just a few years ago a small population breed in the lower Dart Valley and maybe in one or two other places, but to find them up on the hills in the conifers was actually quite a surprise, although in other parts of southern England they are very much associated with some of the more mature plantations. So here they were in largely fairly old Sitka spruce plantations, blocks, and this map shows each of those red spots was a registration of a singing bird, concentrated on the southern slopes, which is where my walks took place, mostly in Chudleigh Parish. There's Chudleigh Parish boundary to give you some idea. The northeastern fringe of Chudleigh Parish extends up onto the edges of Haldon. There's one isolated spot down there in the south near Beggar's Bush, but the others mainly on perhaps the more sheltered slopes, the sunnier, warmer, insect-rich perhaps slopes of Haldon. And certainly that's a population that we'll be keeping a close eye on in future years. That map was sent to the Forestry Commission, so they're aware of where the birds are. As I said, they have special protection, so it would be good if the Commission can take account of their needs in managing the forest in future. There are also large numbers of crossbills in these plantations over the 2019-20 winter. The birds breed quite early in the year, January, February, March, and certainly in April, May there were quite a few family parties with females like this bird feeding their stripy youngsters up in the tops of the conifers. Parts of Haldon are now thankfully devoid of conifers, and this gives rise to the vegetation that used to be present before the plantations were put in nearly 100 years ago now. So Haldon used to be heathland, and on the left in the foreground you can see an area that's been scraped to remove bracken litter and to expose not just the flint that you can see there quite conspicuously and bare ground, but also to help heathers to germinate, so ling and bell heather, and a few grasses too starting to come. So very good areas for certain birds to breed in, and in this particular area things like stone chats and tree pipit, but also one of the Haldon speciality birds, and that's the nightjar. And just in case you think this is a two-headed nightjar, this is a female brooding quite a large youngster in August, so the young was pretty much ready to fly, or would be soon. So Haldon had about over 100 pairs of nightjars located during the last national survey, and for that it's of considerable national significance, and a proportion of those, not the major part, are within our parish. So a real a wonderful sight and sound, particularly to experience on the summer evenings. 2020 proved to be an exceptionally good year for raptors in Chudleigh, and that was partly because people during lockdown spent quite a lot of time peering up into the skies to see what was flying around. And this is a red kite, not a bird that we've seen very often in the parish, but one which seems to be increasing. Maybe one day we'll have them breeding, but rather, well, exceptionally during 2020, I think we had about 8 records of these, of singles or sometimes 2 together, mostly May, June, July, when we know that immature birds from up country somewhere wander down to the southwest and maybe looking for potential breeding sites for the future. Let's hope. Traditionally, Haldon was renowned as one of the locations where you could see honey buzzards. This is a honey buzzard, and last year we had a record of one, probably a migrant bird, flying over the town in May, and there were rumours that there may have been another one sighted later in the summer on Haldon somewhere, but it's one that we would be keeping an eye open for. They have nested in the parish, but albeit not for over 20 years now. So these are summer visitors, and rather hard to identify if you're not very familiar with the common buzzard that we see, of course, on a daily basis around the parish. The peregrines bred again in Palace Quarry, There's an adult bird at the top and a juvenile below, both photographed over my garden. So the birds from the quarry fly around the town quite a bit, particularly in July, August time, when the young are being taught how to feed and actually being presented with food as well by the parents. And they screech loudly, very, very noisy birds, the youngsters. So it's good to have them still around. Sadly, we can't say the same for kestrel, which may be on the verge of disappearing from the parish altogether. 20-30 years ago, there was one or two or three breeding pairs that I knew of around the town, one in Palace Quarry at times, another one at Hamsbarton, but I failed to see a kestrel at all in the parish last year. We had, I think, only 2 sightings. We fear that the misuse of rodenticides could be something to do with this, and by that I mean rodenticides that are used legally to control rodents, rats in particular, but which leave birds of prey, predators, open to poisoning in a secondary way, because the rats may have a non-toxic load before they actually die, and during that period they're very easy prey for birds like kestrel and buzzard for that matter. We don't seem to have a problem with our buzzard population, but kestrels, which 20 or 30 years ago were very familiar birds, particularly along dual carriageways and motorways, are now becoming a rare sight. One of the other rare species of raptor that we've had in the parish, certainly mainly in the Haldon area for a number of years, is the goshawk. A very difficult bird to see, to be honest, quite a reclusive woodland dweller. But just a few days ago, before the AGM, Fraser Rush was overjoyed to capture these images on a camera trap. And this was taken in the west of the parish. And this is a juvenile female goshawk, and she's actually caught a pheasant. That shows you what a powerful bird the goshawk is. In fact, the female goshawk is about the same sort of body size and wingspan of a buzzard, so they are big birds. In the Oldway Batfields, which are now managed by the Devon Wildlife Trust, we have one small field that's not grazed. This is what's known as the Suds Field. The Sustainable Urban Drainage Scheme lies in the bottom here in this scraped out hollow, and there's a channel where excess rainwater during storms comes from the adjacent Lower Trindle Close. So this was built as part of the development there, and indeed the other fields were donated to Devon Wildlife Trust as part of the planning deal with Teign. So this scraped area proved to be really interesting, as well as the surrounding scrub and long grass during the summer. It's a real hot spot, very sheltered, and particularly good for insects. But though many of those insects rely on bare ground, and many of the others are reliant on particular species of plants. So it was with some amazement, in fact, that we recorded 90 species of plants in this little field during the spring and summer. And perhaps not terribly surprising, 20 species of butterflies. It's a good total. It's more than you'll see in the average Chudleigh garden, but they were clearly breeding here. Amongst those were a couple of records of brown argus, which is a very scarce butterfly in these parts. And here on a blackthorn twig, a brown hairstreak egg. That little white spot is the egg of the brown hairstreak, a butterfly which possibly no one has ever seen an adult of in Chudleigh. The adults clearly exist, at least the females do, because we found over the years, we've found the eggs widely around the parish on certain types of blackthorn, scrub and hedgerows. Much more widespread and more easily seen, the marbled white, good population in the meadow in this little field here, and also very large numbers of grasshoppers and bush crickets. So this is a bush cricket known as the long-winged conehead, a relatively recent addition to the Devon fauna. It spread across southern England, probably as a result of climate change, and there are a number of these in amongst the long grassy areas here. This is just off Oldway, and the gate in the distance in the middle is the entrance to the Bat Run. So this is a double, like a green lane now, where the Greater Horseshoe Bats and other bats can commute, come over Oldway at the end and then on down into the Teign Valley. This photo was taken in May, just before cattle were given access. They were rather late coming on this year. There had to be some fencing done before they could come on. But you'll see the white flowers here are lady's smock or cuckoo flower, and these are the food plants of the orange tip butterfly. So this is a female orange tip. She doesn't have the orange tips to the wings, and she's actually just laying an egg underneath the flower buds there, and the larva that hatches out of that will feed on the seed pods that form as the flowers are pollinated and then produce seeds. So they did well, certainly until the cattle came in. It was very important, however, that the cattle did come in, because the cowpats are there to produce lots of invertebrates for Greater Horseshoe Bats. So the cattle are not wormed, and therefore their dung is able to be colonised by numbers of dung beetles, dung flies and so on. And these are fantastic food, in fact pretty essential food, especially for young Greater Horseshoe Bats as they first start to fly in late summer. We were able to put out a few dormouse monitoring tubes, these are called, aluminium tubes, with a space at the end to build a nest, and this is just 2 or 3 weeks after we put them out in May. There's a dormouse nest at the end of that. It's not a breeding nest, but the dormouse will cuddle up in there during the day and then at night come out to explore the trees. Now, dormice are relatively widespread in Devon, and certainly in our bigger hedgerows and broad-leaved woodlands. And we knew they were present on site before Lower Trendle Close was developed, because they'd been found. So it was quite good that we very quickly had them using these monitoring tubes. During the summer we also put out 10 boxes that could be used for breeding purposes. So this is a dormouse nest in one of the boxes. So we had 2, maybe 3 breeding attempts late in the season. So this photograph was actually taken at the beginning of November, which is extremely late and normally beyond the time that one would be looking for dormice. But there's the nest showing occupancy, and indeed that was the occupant of one of the nests we found. So there's a genuine Chudleigh dormouse. Along Lawn Drive we have been managing the verges for, well, as it says there, birds, bees, bats and butterflies. So we're trying to encourage the floristic diversity, so get a better range of flowers and plants growing here that will in turn provide lots of little insects, butterflies and so on, that in turn will be eaten by the larger organisms like birds and maybe bats. So what we've done is to only mow next to the road and next to the footpath and leave other areas unmown for several weeks. These areas have been cut and then the cuttings raked up and removed, and then taken away for composting. The this activity will reduce the nutrient loading and therefore the quantity of grass in the verges, and will eventually give rise to a wider range of broadleaf plants and flowers growing in the sward. And we've also planted or sown yellow rattle seeds. The yellow rattle is a hemiparasite on grasses, on the grass roots, and weakens the grass growth. So again, that's helping to open up the sward and give a greater variety of plants. So that will be ongoing in future years. You can also see there the nice floristic rich flower beds that have got many native plants and also very useful garden plants in them for everyone to enjoy, including the wildlife, of course. So that takes me on to my own garden, and for the last 2 years we've not mown our lawn during spring and midsummer, and you can see a nice taller sward has developed, particularly on the right. I have an area of coarse grasses marginal to a pond on the left, but on the right quite a variety of white clover you can see there, and plantain, and at times we had some really interesting things develop there. So I've been amazed actually to find over 50 species of different species of plants in both this lawn and my front lawn in the last couple of years, which is amazing diversity. Admittedly, we have never fertilized these lawns, so they've had well over 30 years of nutrient depletion because of the mowings being taken off. So that's part of my front lawn in the spring when self-heal blossomed, and we had these nice purple patches. In other areas I've got violets doing the same. And a bit later in the summer, this is not dandelions, but these are cat's ear, and cat's ear is a very good nectar source, pollen source, and quite easy to get in a lawn that's relatively low in nutrient levels. So please hold off on those fertilizers, folks. We have a lot of self-seeded forget-me-nots, and in 2019 we were overjoyed to have a scarlet tiger moth emerging around the edge of the pond. It came up and then moved into the grasses and hung around for a couple of weeks afterwards. So in spring 2020 we were equally pleased to find just 4 scarlet tiger moth caterpillars feeding on the forget-me-nots, stripping the leaves off, and they subsequently disappeared. Amazingly, in July we had 4 adult scarlet tiger moths, maybe from those very same caterpillars, and we were also very pleased to see a pair of those mating on one occasion, so hopefully they're here to stay. There's the adult, beautiful moth, a day-flying moth, and with brilliant scarlet hind wings that you don't see until they fly. Here's another view of my back lawn after I've undertaken what we've come to call drunken mowing. So this is rather random mowing of strips to break up the monotony, if you like, of tall grass, and to give some other species light and to be able to therefore attract a wider range of plants and insects. In the background beyond the path you can see 3 plastic trays. Now these are what are known as refugia, and they're put down to heat up during the spring and for the rest of the summer, and that is attractive to reptiles. And we've been pleased to play host to 1 or 2 slow worms regularly under the refugia. That one on the left didn't prove to be too attractive to slow worm, possibly because there was a rather nice ant's nest underneath it. Now this is a mix of pupae, so the creamy coloured oval things are pupae. The bright shiny things are the adult ants, so these are the alates that will fly away ultimately and form new colonies. And there are also some smaller worker ants. And what we discovered was that in early morning, if you lifted up the tray, you would find this sort of sight, lots of things near the surface, because it was warming up. And then as the day heated up, you went back and looked later on, and there's almost nothing to be seen. They've all got taken and gone down below ground where it's cooler. So the ants were indeed working very hard, those workers particularly working very hard, bringing the brood up and down as the day progressed. Now both the pupae, those creamy coloured things, come in two sizes, and the winged ants also come in two sizes, and the bigger ones are the queens, the females, the smaller ones are the males. So we learned a lot about our ants during the summer, and we also learned that these winged ones appeared 3 or 4 weeks before the main flight of the ants. Perhaps many of you will know that these ants synchronise their emergence, and very often they all come out at the end of a very hot, humid day in late July or August. And this year, I think it was actually early August when the majority of these flew. And it's a very short-lived phenomenon, and often you become aware of it because there are starlings or other birds flying in the sky overhead, feasting on these flying ants. We were also overjoyed that the grass snake that we glimpsed in 2019 was still around. It's only a little one, just over a foot long, 15-20 centimetres, sorry, 30, maybe 40 centimetres long. And we're hoping it's going to take a toll on our very large newt population. So that's a grass snake, always a pleasure to have. So during lockdown, when the weather was not so good, I spent quite a lot of time collating all the known wildlife records for the parish, and that resulted by the end of the year in a series of what I've called annotated checklists. They're not all annotated, they don't all explain very much apart from a species name, but most of them so far do. We've got 7 now available on the Chudleigh Wild web page, each of them a PDF that you can download and read at your leisure. There's lots of good information there, and we're appealing to people to please find mistakes in them, please find things to add to them and let us know. There are a few more also on the horizon, not too far away. We have probably a comprehensive list of moths for the parish. Other invertebrates is a bit more of a challenge because there are huge numbers of insects and indeed other things that we want to try and put in that document. Fish, we have a few species from the watercourses. Fungi is a big challenge. We know we have one extremely good site for waxcap fungi in Deer Park Farm in the west of the parish. But there are many, many others that aren't always easy to put a name to. So they're all available, or at least the 7 on the left are now available to download from the Town Council website. There's the address. Googling Chudleigh Wild will find you a way to get to it. So if I can just look ahead to this coming year, we have quite a lot of tasks awaiting us. Some of them ongoing, some of them new. I'm not going to dwell on those. You can always pause this video and read them. But the final one, Gardening for Wildlife, is a new initiative that you'll be hearing more about, I'm sure. We're asking people to manage their gardens in such a way that we create stepping stones and corridors, and we end up with a community nature reserve in effect. There's potential for an awful lot of wildlife to be found in gardens, and for anyone who's willing to do a few things in their garden, we'll give them a sign to put up to explain what's going on. Maybe, dare I say, to explain to neighbours why the garden's looking a little bit untidy. We do have an obsession with tidiness, which is generally not good for wildlife. And there's a series of actions that people might like to take, and we're asking them if they would like to choose one from each column to do something by way of wildlife food or water or shelter or management in some way to benefit wildlife. Then we'll give them one of those notices. Or indeed, if perhaps they want to give their children a little bit of the garden to do their thing with, we'll give them a blank sign and the children can design it themselves. So hopefully you'll be hearing a lot more about that over the coming year. Okay, so finally, just to repeat that we have a web page with more information on it and copies, for example, of past newsletters. If you'd like to be on our mailing list and get regular newsletters coming through, then there's the email address to make contact with. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.